You noticed a hairline crack across your bedroom ceiling last spring and told yourself it was probably nothing. The same thing every landlord says. You never reported it. Neither did the two tenants before you. It's 27 BCE, and you're 4 floors up in a rented room in Rome holding a wax tablet that proves this month's rent is paid, and the wall behind you has almost the same crack. The legal limit on this building is 70 Roman feet, close to 21 meters, written into law because buildings exactly like this one kept coming down on the people renting them. Rome would eventually rewrite that law once, lower the ceiling, and keep watching buildings fall anyway, decade after decade, with the same tenants inside them and the same landlords collecting rent on the way down. I'll be upfront about this because it's the part people get backwards. We assume ancient Rome's famous engineering, the aqueducts, the roads, the concrete domes, means Roman housing must have been just as solid. It wasn't. The empire that could move water uphill for 100 kilometers could not, or would not, keep an apartment building standing over its own tenants. I'm not talking about one collapse. I'm talking about a government that legislated the exact same problem twice, decades apart, which is not a sign of a fixed problem. It's the signature of a failed one. And this wasn't some fringe provincial issue. By the height of the empire, Rome held something close to 1 million people, and the overwhelming majority of them never owned a house at all. They rented a room in a building from a landlord who had every legal and financial incentive to do the bare minimum. So today, we're going through all of it. The stairs nobody wanted to live at the top of, the cracks a landlord papered over instead of fixing, the height law Rome had to write twice because the first version didn't work, the wooden props holding up walls that were already bulging outward, the eviction that could happen on one fixed date every year, no matter who you were. And the strangest part of the whole thing, a Roman senator who got rich specifically by refusing to put out fires until he owned the burning building. By the end of this, you're going to understand exactly why the ancient world's most famous fortune was built in part on other people's ceilings falling in, and why the fix Rome came up with twice still didn't stop it a third time. Let's go. Here's how we actually know any of this because it matters more than usual with this topic. Rome's apartment blocks were mud brick, then brick-faced concrete, built to be lived in, not admired. And buildings like that don't survive on purpose. Almost all of them are gone. But on the Capitoline Hill, under a church, there is one exception. The Insula dell'Ara Coeli, a single Roman apartment block still standing, 4 or 5 of its original floors intact from a building that once rose 6 or 7 stories. It didn't survive because Rome protected it. It survived because later builders just kept stacking new walls on top of the old ones instead of tearing them down, burying the evidence under 5 more centuries of construction until archaeologists cleared it out in the 1930s. Keep that in your head, because we're coming back to it, and it's going to mean something different by the end. Here's the assumption almost everyone makes without noticing they're making it. You hear that Augustus capped building height at 70 Roman feet, and your brain quietly files that under solved. A law got passed, the dangerous buildings stopped, Rome moved on. That's the intuitive read, because it's how we expect laws to work now. You pass a fire code, buildings meet the fire code. Case closed, box checked, nobody thinks about it again. It feels reasonable, specifically because you've never had to live somewhere the enforcement was optional, and the fines were survivable for the landlord, and only the landlord. The Roman historian Aurelius Victor knocks that assumption flat. Writing around 360 CE in a short imperial history called the Caesaribus, he records that the Emperor Trajan, more than a century after Augustus, had to issue his own decree lowering the legal height limit again, this time down to 60 Roman feet, and he states the reason outright. Buildings kept collapsing, and the cost in lives had gotten expensive enough that the government intervened a second time. A law that worked doesn't get rewritten by a different emperor 100 years later for the exact same reason. A law that failed does. For a long time, nobody could actually answer the next question, which is the more interesting one. Did anybody obey these height laws, or did builders just quietly ignore a limit nobody was enforcing? A legal cap on paper tells you what Augustus wanted. It doesn't tell you what got built. And for most of the 20th century, that question stayed unanswered, because almost every insula in Rome had been demolished, rebuilt over, or scavenged for stone across 2,000 years, leaving foundations at best. You can't measure a building that isn't there anymore, and you can't trust a law to describe a city instead of just regulating one. Then, between 1997 and 2002, the German archaeologist Sascha Priester spent 5 years doing something nobody had done properly before: a full structural survey of the Insula dell'Ara Coeli itself, cross-checking the standing brickwork against archaeological reports, inscriptions, and literary sources published as a detailed case study inside his larger project cataloging Rome's surviving apartment buildings. What he confirmed is that Roman builders had figured out brick-faced concrete, a technique called opus latericium, strong enough to push a building right up against the legal ceiling and sometimes past it. Floor after floor stacked on a skeleton that could genuinely hold that much weight. The height limit wasn't the thing keeping tenants alive. The concrete was doing that job when it was done properly, which was exactly the part nobody was checking. That's what breaks the picture open, because it means the danger was never really about how tall the law allowed a building to be. It was about the 4, 5, 6 flights of narrow wooden stairs a tenant actually climbed every single day to get to a room the landlord had cut every possible corner building, on a foundation nobody outside the family living on it ever inspected. Here's the number that puts Rome's version of this problem in scale. By the 4th century, an administrative document called the Regionary Catalogue, essentially a city inventory drawn up for the imperial government, counted 46,602 insulae standing in Rome against just 1,882 private houses. Do the math, and roughly 96 out of every 100 residential buildings in the entire capital was the kind of place we've been describing. Not a mansion, a rented block someone else owned and someone else was supposed to maintain. Now here's the modern number, and it isn't a rough guess either. In 2023, New York City's Department of Housing Preservation and Development issued 1.2 million housing code violations across more than 300,000 buildings, and a separate enforcement sweep flagged 250 of the city's worst buildings, carrying close to 39,000 open violations between them, with millions of dollars in unpaid emergency repairs. 2,000 years, a different continent, a different building material, and the exact same shape of problem. A landlord who owns the risk and a tenant who lives inside it. The wall doesn't know what century it's in. Now, come back to the actual crack, because this is where the arc closes. The Roman jurist Alphanus, writing in the 1st century BCE and preserved for us inside a much later legal compilation called the Digest, drew a specific line that survives almost word for word. A tenant had to tolerate minor discomfort, but a landlord was legally obligated to repair a defect serious enough to threaten the property or the people in it. On paper, that's real protection, written down more than 2,000 years before your lease agreement existed, which makes the next part worse, not better. The poet Juvenal, writing around 100 CE, described Rome as a city held up mostly by thin wooden props, where a landlord papers over a wide old crack and tells everyone to sleep easy at the very edge of collapse. Cicero, in a private letter to his friend Atticus dated to the 18th of April, 44 BCE, casually mentioned that 2 of his own rental shops had just fallen down and the rest were cracking, and that even the mice had moved out, and admitted he felt no more than mild irritation about it, because he was already pricing the higher rent he'd charge once it was rebuilt. The law existed. The landlord simply priced around it. Here's the part modern audiences squirm at, and Romans genuinely did not. We like our villains to at least hide it. Rome didn't require that. Marcus Licinius Crassus is remembered today as one of the richest men who ever lived, rich enough to later bankroll a third of the empire's power in an informal alliance with Pompey and Julius Caesar. And a meaningful slice of that fortune came directly out of buildings like the one we've been standing in this whole video. Republican Rome had no public fire service of any kind. None. If your insula caught fire, the closest thing to help was whoever showed up and agreed to a price first. Crassus turned that gap into a business model. According to the biographer Plutarch, writing around 100 CE in his Life of Crassus, Crassus assembled a private crew of more than 500 slaves, all trained as architects and builders, and kept them ready. When a fire broke out, his men rushed to the scene and then did nothing at all, while Crassus personally negotiated a purchase price with the terrified, smoke-choked owner standing in the street. If the price wasn't low enough, he simply let the building keep burning and made a lower offer once it and the buildings beside it had finished collapsing. Plutarch's own summary of the method is blunt. Crassus built his fortune out of fire and disaster, buying up a large share of Rome one burning insula at a time. And here's the detail that turns this from villainy into something closer to a business plan. Crassus didn't demolish what he bought. He rebuilt it with his own 500-strong construction crew and rented the finished apartments back out, sometimes to the very same displaced tenants who'd just watched their home burn down in front of them. The fire wasn't the end of the transaction. It was the opening one. Let's put a real name on the other side of this transaction, because so far this has been about landlords, and there's a wall in Pompeii that lets us hear it from the renting side instead. On the exterior of a building known today as the Insula Ariana Poliana, archaeologists found a large painted notice, red and black letters on whitewashed plaster, sized to be read by someone walking past on the street, not standing close. Catalogued as CIL 4138, it advertises shops with living quarters attached, high-quality upstairs apartments, and an entire house, all available in a property block owned by a man named Gnaeus Aelius Nigidius Maius, a real Pompeian politician attested in nearly 20 other inscriptions around the city. The notice gives a move-in date, the 1st of July, and tells anyone interested to go find Primus, Maius's own slave, who handled the leasing. Sit with what that sign is actually doing. This is an ancient landlord's rental listing, painted directly onto the street-facing wall of the very building being advertised. Run day to day, not by the owner, but by an enslaved property manager with the authority to sign someone into a home. And the 1st of July wasn't a random date. It shows up again in the poet Martial, complaining about a tenant named Vacera evicted on that exact same calends of July for falling behind on rent, his belongings hauled out into the street in front of the whole neighborhood. One inscription tells you how you got in. One poem tells you how you got thrown back out. Between them, a Roman renter's entire year is written down on 2 separate walls in 2 different cities by 2 people who never met each other and never met you. And here's where I have to be honest with you, because this channel does not fake certainty. We don't have a Roman fire department's incident log or a city coroner's report telling us exactly how many insulae came down in a given year. So when people say collapse was routine, they're reasoning from a stack of individual complaints, not a body count. We don't know how literally to take Cicero calling his fallen shops shops rather than a full rental block, since the word he used could describe either. And we should be honest that Plutarch was writing well over a century after Crassus died, drawing on a hostile political tradition that had every reason to paint Rome's most notorious dead billionaire as a monster. So the arithmetic of exactly how much of his fortune came from fire, specifically, is probably impossible to pin down precisely. None of that erases the pattern. A law rewritten twice for the same failure, a jurist's opinion admitting landlords could be sued, a poet, a politician, and a slave named on a wall, all describing the identical shape of risk from different angles 2,000 years apart, is not a coincidence. You get to explain away just because nobody kept a spreadsheet. So go back to that fourth floor room in 27 BCE, wax tablet in hand, the same crack running behind you that's running through your own bedroom ceiling right now. Remember what we said about the Insula dell'Ara Coeli, the one Roman apartment building still standing today. It isn't standing because anyone protected it. It's standing because it got buried, ignored, and built over for 1,500 years, and the neglect that should have destroyed it is the exact reason it survived long enough for someone to finally dig it back out and look. The thing that endangered a tenant is the same thing that preserved the evidence. That's not a coincidence either. That's just what happens to anything nobody's paying close attention to. Which brings us back to you, on your own Tuesday, looking at that crack and deciding it's probably nothing. It isn't a moral failing. It's the same calculation the tenant on the fourth floor made in 27 BCE, the same one Vacera made right up until the 1st of July. You've been trained across 2,000 years and 2 different continents to assume the wall is somebody else's problem until it very suddenly isn't. Tonight, when you walk past that ceiling again, you'll probably still say nothing. That's the whole point. So, question for you. If your landlord ignored a cracking wall for months, would you actually trust the deposit to protect you? Or would you just quietly start looking for a reason to move? Let me know in the comments. Until then, see you soon.